Okay, good afternoon. My name is Elvis Barasa, and I'm a psychologist. So today, this afternoon, our session will be centered on the topic addict's personality. So this afternoon, we are going to discuss on what traits can make a person or an individual to be predisposed to developing addiction. That's what we'll be discussing this afternoon. So, to dive in first, we find that when you are an addict, you portray or you have certain traits, or you may develop certain traits that may make you to be predisposed to addiction. To begin with, I'll start with the trait one is the underlying mental health conditions. You will find that underlying mental health conditions such as schizophrenia, depression, and anxiety make a person to be predisposed to developing addiction. In what sense? There is a research which was done by the University of Rockefeller that discovered that people who had a mental health condition called schizophrenia were highly addicted to nicotine. This is because they believed that nicotine could be able to lessen the severity of their condition. So they tend to be hooked up on nicotine. And because nicotine has that addictive nature, they end up developing that addiction, totally dependent to the nicotine. So that is just an example of how the underlying mental health condition can make a person to develop addiction. Another point is the obsessive and compulsive trait. In what sense? This obsessive and compulsive trait is when a person has that compulsion, is when a person has an absolute and irresistible urge that is driving him or her to indulge in a certain behavior. So if a person has that trait of obsessive, that having that extreme focus on something, that is what we call obsessive, and having that compulsion, that an absolute irresistible urge to indulge in a certain behavior. So that person, if a person portrays that behavior or has that trait, we say that he is highly susceptible to developing addiction. Because when you have that compulsion, it's that urge that is driving you. So you can be easily hooked up on psychoactive drugs. So because of that compulsion aspect in it. So we again move to trait 3, which is adventurous or risk-taking trait. This adventurous or risk-taking trait happens in a sense that when a person is so much adventurous, and if a person has a high appetite to engaging in a risky behavior, you find that that person's dopamine levels in the brain are always high. That's why you'll find a person, you've seen a person, maybe these people who ride this racing, they race bikes. They do a very high speed in a very dangerous road. Why? Because they have developed that behavior because they are adventurous. One, and that adventurous aspect always make their dopamine levels to be high. So what will such people do when their dopamine levels drop? They will tend to try to push again that dopamine to be high, so that they can always indulge in a certain behavior. And that's why you see they will seek to maintain that high dopamine level, because at optimal level, dopamine is a brain chemical, or a hormone in the brain which is responsible for pleasure. So we'll find that people who are highly adventurous and who have high appetite of risk, their dopamine levels in the brain are always high. So if that dopamine tend to drop a bit, you'll find that they have a problem. And how will they tend to keep their dopamine high? To repetitively engage in such behavior, so that they can always keep their dopamine above par. And this is why they are also at high risk of developing being addicted to certain drugs, because there are some drugs which when taken, or even all drugs when taken, they tend to raise the dopamine levels in the brain. So you'll find that such people, when they see that they kind of feel low, they tend to ingest drugs so that they can push that dopamine levels to another level which is not supposed to reach. So that adventurous and risk-taking traits, you'll find that people who exhibit such trait are highly susceptible to developing addiction. Another point or another trait is a person who is isolated. Isolated. So isolated in what sense? When you are isolated, self-isolated, you find that you have a problem with making social relationships with others. So if you have that trait of being an isolated person, you find that you will seek other avenues to maybe to remedy your isolation, because you are very poor at making a social relationship, and in that sense you will now tend to use other avenues to make you to be able to cope now with your isolatedness. So you might end up even now indulging in drugs, or that, because you cannot relate with people well. So even with the opposite gender you can't. So you might resort to ingesting drugs so that you can find that courage now to form those interpersonal relations. So that's why we are saying in this session that people who mostly self-isolate themselves, they might be at high risk of developing addiction. Also, or while at it, we find that there's another trait, which is the inability of a person to self-regulate. What is self-regulation? Self-regulation is a state whereby a person is able to take control, or have that control, or have those coping skills to deal with either their behavior. They can regulate their behavior, they can regulate their emotions, they can regulate their feelings. So if a person has that inability to self-regulate, it means that a person is unable to take charge of his feelings, his emotions, and his behavior. And if a person lacks that self-regulation, he might end up developing an addictive behavior. For instance, if a person is unable to regulate his feelings, let's say if a person is experiencing stress, many a times, because we are human beings, we are wired in a sense that when we encounter a problem, when we encounter a problem, we tend to seek for an escape route rather than confronting a problem. So if a person doesn't take charge of his feelings, and maybe, for example, we have used an example of stress. If a person has stress, he or she will resort to other means, such as indulging in a drug, so that he can maybe forget those stressful moments, of which it is not helpful, or it is not healthy. So if a person has that inability to control, to have that self-regulation, that aspect of controlling his emotions, his behaviors, and his feelings, he might be at high risk of developing addiction, as I've just explained, because such a person cannot take charge of his feelings, such a person cannot take charge of his emotions, such a person cannot take charge of his behavior. So if a person also have that tendency of indulging in risky behaviors, in this sense now, he doesn't know how to control himself. He will end up engaging in that risk behavior more and more and more and more again, and that's what can easily lead to addiction. So if a person lacks that self-regulation, is highly susceptible to addiction. Another point on it is that when a person, if a person has a low self-esteem, that is another trait, low self-esteem trait. When a person has low self-esteem, a person doesn't value him or herself. A person sees herself or himself valueless. He or she sees herself as not of value at all. That self-worth is very low. When your self-esteem is low, equally your self-worth is low. in equal measure. So what does such a person do? To raise or to feel also that he is a person enough, he might end up indulging in addiction. In what sense? Let's say, for example, a person has that low self-esteem. He will resort to taking something that can make him feel lively again. Take something that can make him feel a person who is at least, who feel at least that he is valued. So you'll find that if you have a low self-esteem trait, you'll find yourself, you are also at high risk of developing addiction, because anytime that you experience those low esteem scenarios, you'll just resort to taking drugs so that you can elevate your mood, so that you can feel now that you are valuable enough, so that you can feel now that you are a person enough. But if you are on the low, you tend to have that low self-esteem. You don't feel like you are valued enough, so you might resort in taking drugs, because drugs always, as we know, they temper with our dopamine levels. So when they temper with it, when they push that from the dopamine level from the optimal level to that level which is not supposed to be reached, now you'll start feeling like you are now a person enough. So those are some of the traits that are associated with an addict or an addict's personality. So we should be on the lookout. We should be keen on these things, because addiction is a thing that, as we've said earlier in these previous sessions, it is a disease. So those are some of the traits that makes a person to be predisposed to developing addiction. So we should be keen with ourselves. We should know how to combat these things before maybe they affect us. So once again, I'd like to thank you, Mr. Mutugi, for giving me this opportunity to share on those some of the traits. And I believe that we have created awareness through this session on what traits should people look at. If you have that compulsion, that compulsive nature, that we normally call it OCD, you know that you are at a high risk of developing addiction because of that compulsion nature. We've also seen that if you have a problem with self-regulation, if you cannot take control of your feelings, of your emotions, of your behavior, you are at high risk of developing addiction. You have also seen that if you have that adventurous or risk-taking trait, you also find that you are at a very high risk. If you have self-esteem, low self-esteem also, you have also seen that you are at a great risk. So these are some of the traits that are highly associated with addiction or with an addict's personality. And also, before I forget, we have also seen those underlying mental health conditions such as schizo, which I've said the research was done. And the research shown that people who were having that schizophrenia condition were highly linked to be addicted to nicotine, because they believe that nicotine could lessen the severity of their condition. So I think with that, I'm through with this session, and I believe that people have been sensitized, and now they are aware of some of the traits that are associated with an addict's personality. Thank you.